Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting Wednesday webinar at Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. I am Behruz Khamari, and I'm the director of the center, and it's my true pleasure today to introduce Professor Shirin Saeidi and her book, which we are going to discuss a little bit later. Let me first thank, as always, our events coordinator, Becky Parnian, and Pete Novak, our technical support for always making these events a very smooth and enjoyable occasions. Let me first go over some of the logistics of this conversation today. We are going to ask Professor Saeidi to talk for around 15 minutes or so, and then Professor Arzoo Osanloo would discuss the book and raise some questions for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open for questions from the audience at the end of the initial conversation. You can submit your questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. I would read your questions and pose them to our distinguished guests. So let me, without further ado, introduce our author today. Dr. Shirin Saeidi is an assistant professor of political science and an affiliated faculty, a member of Middle East Studies program at the University of Arkansas. She earned her bachelor's degree in government and politics from the University of Maryland in College Park, and her PhD in politics and international relations from Cambridge University at the UK. In addition to her newly released book, I believe it just came out a couple of weeks ago, titled Women and the Islamic Republic, How Gender Citizenship Conditioned the Iranian State. I hope you can see the beautiful cover of the book. She has also published numerous articles and book chapters that have appeared in Gender and History, Citizenship Studies, International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, and many other journals. She has been on the editorial board of the Journal of Citizenship Studies since 2014. She's also on the International Advisory Board of the Journal of International and Global Studies. Here with us, Professor Arzoo Osanloo, a familiar face to us because we always take advantage of her generosity to be a part of our conversations and to be a guest in our events. Is a professor in the Department of Law, Society, and Justice, and the director of University of Washington's Middle East Center. She earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford University. Prior to that, she practiced law, having received her JD from the American University in Washington. She is the author of two very important books, The Politics of Women's Rights in Iran, which came out in 2009, and Forgiveness Work, Mercy, Law, and Victims' Right in Iran, which came out last year, both by Princeton University Press. So without any further delay, I would ask Professor Saeidi to present the book, which is, again, I have to emphasize, what a treat it was for me to read the book. And it's such a pleasure to have her here with us today. So the screen is yours, Professor Saeidi.
Thank you so much for those kind words and this introduction. I'm so excited to be in conversation with both of you. So I'm going to give a brief overview of my book and how it developed. My book brings together the experiences of Islamist, leftist, and secular women in post-1979 Iran to understand what women's resistance to state formation creates. Each chapter of Women in the Islamic Republic touches upon the different forms and scales of citizenship that have developed in post-1979 Iran within the context of the Iran-Iraq War, legal inequalities, ambiguous governance, and legacies of the war in post-1988. The book relies on ethnographic methods in a non-Western context to explore concepts central to political science, but typically examined through European history, such as war, state formation, and citizenship. I conducted 9 years of field work, which included archival research and interviews in Iran. And between 2012 to 2014, I lived and worked in Tehran. I also conducted interviews in Europe and the United States with former leftist political prisoners. The main theoretical contribution of Women in the Islamic Republic is the claim that the unstable nexus between statecraft and particular performances makes acts of citizenship central to the state's conditioning. I rethink Ingen Eisen's notion of acts of citizenship as a concept that discloses how citizenship forms in momentary bursts through contentious politics aimed at the state and society, while Eisen conflates acts of citizenship with the right to demand rights, I refrain from this approach by looking at citizenship as appeals made to the state and its institutions. We place limits on women's engagement with rights. Each chapter illustrates the diverse, complementary, and conflicting notions of rights, roles, and responsibilities that the women included in this study express through their rights demands, pursuit of spiritual growth, moral calculations, and formation of belonging during different moments in post-revolutionary Iranian history. Moreover, each chapter demonstrates how in particular moments research participants' acts of citizenship uphold and in other instances destabilize larger power structures in the Islamic Republic. Before getting into a summary of the other chapters, because this was pretty much a summary of the first chapter, I want to say a few words about how this book developed, because that will speak to the different audiences that may find it useful. On a superficial political level, this book was inspired by my opposition to the narratives coming out of Washington, D.C., where I grew up, that depicted Muslim women as victims that needed to be saved through international wars. My book approaches the sociological study of the Iran-Iraq War with a lens on gender to challenge such problematic frameworks for human rights. I argue in the book that political scientists can better contribute to global politics, including the impact of wars, by relying on ethnographic methods. The book joins many others written by Iranian American and Muslim American scholars that came of age in the post-9/11 era. Due to its focus on the intersex of gender, religion, and political change, this book will be of interest to Iranian and American policymakers alike. As I began to conduct the literature review for this book, I realized that some feminist scholars had addressed the particular forms of resistance that women in the Middle East perform in an effort to build a case against US military interventions in the region. This work inspired me and continues to do so. However, my audience was different. In this book, I was not so much interested in depicting how Iranian women challenge national oppression to make a case before audiences in the US or elsewhere in the West. Instead, I wanted to create a text that spoke to the meaning of the losses that we endured in the 1980s and the post-war years. In essence, this book argues that women's acts of citizenship were not only practices that remade institutions, they also transformed how a nation imagines themselves in times of stability and crisis, precisely because of the interventions of these acts and the normative social practices that were dominant at the time. In short, my book demonstrates that the Iranian imagination regarding social organization, gender relations, romantic relationships, caregiving flourished in institutional and mindful ways that domestic and international violence cannot erase. So the second audience that would be interested possibly in this book are post-colonial scholars, feminist activists, and political theorists. This book then is a book of political history with an Iranian audience in mind wherever they may reside. However, this book for me is not only about offering one historical interpretation of the past for future generations to consider. It is also about thinking comparatively through our own aesthetics and narratives as Iranians to heal current cuts and bruises, especially those of our political activists. Given that the political figures we lost in the 1980s were particularly powerful ancestors to young Iranians today, I hope the book serves as a form of connection between generations. This book is an opportunity to reflect on the lived experiences of individuals who were fully in present time. And so the third audience that this book will be of interest to are perhaps those for whom politics is the art of caregiving and love. So that's sort of to situate who I'm speaking to and the particular style of writing and research that I undertook. I want to say a few words now about each chapter. The first chapter, State Formation and Citizenship, an Investigation Beyond a Eurocentric Gaze, lays out the methodological and theoretical contributions of the book, which I think we'll talk more about, and I talked about briefly in my initial statement. Chapter 2, Reflecting on an Idealized Past, Memory and Women's Rights Struggles in Post-Revolutionary Iran, is one of my favorite chapters. I rewrote it like 6 times or more, but the chapter challenges the linear connection that is made between the past to the present in deciphering women's conceptualization of their status, and formation of rights, roles, and responsibilities. Leftist, Islamist, and secular women active in the 1980s, as well as Hezbollah cultural activists today, remember being influenced by their immediate memories and experiences with gender inequality. The chapter offers a new feminist reading process through which Iranian women become politically active. Chapter 3, Revolutionary Citizens, the Confrontation of Power in Spiritual Acts of Citizenship from 1980 to 88. I introduce my notion of spiritual acts of citizenship, acts geared towards preserving one's status as a revolutionary citizen. Spiritual acts of citizenship were constituted through the broader ethical framework that political spirituality offered during the early days of the revolution, and as Foucault addressed and Professor Qamari Tabrizi elaborated upon. As Professor Qamari Tabrizi has argued, Foucault's notion of political spirituality is rooted in a process of self-care as the individual becomes other than what one is. I illustrate that women's actual interventions in routine political affairs rested on an effort to preserve the self that they had created with care. I argue in this chapter that spiritual acts of citizenship centered on a desire to live a dignified life and not just a fascination with fearless self-sacrifice. So this chapter responds to some of the critiques of Foucault's analysis and expands it. Chapter 4, The Body in Isolation, Morality and Reconstruction of the Nation in Wartime. This chapter centers on the body and women's moral calculations to highlight how gender was rethought and reworked, and how gender roles were remade during the 1980 to 88 period to contest the established idea in political science that feminism and nationalism are incompatible. While chapter 3 draws attention to self-care that's centered on the individual, chapter 4 highlights focus on community and collectives with respect to care. As acts of citizenship here are about a kind of recognition that cannot be understood in a rights framework alone. The chapter, again, contributes to Eisen's understanding and takes it in a new direction. Chapter 5 and 6 are looking at the legacies of the Iran-Iraq War. Chapter 5 is the aftermath of war, wives and daughters of martyrs, and the post-1988 state. And I argue in this chapter that women who lost their husbands and fathers in the Iran-Iraq War, really prior to 2009, led the movement for democratic reform in Iran. After 2009, they were, because of their position, their strong position, we saw and heard from them less in the national media, and a focus developed on the martyrs of the Syrian conflict. Chapter 6 draws attention to another group of Islamists who are in many ways operating within the context of the legacies of the war. It's titled Iran's Hezbollah and Citizenship Politics, the Surprises of Islamization Projects in Post-2009 Iran. And in this chapter, I argue that after the contested presidential election in 2009, the state created a series of cultural institutes. And one of the main aims of these institutes was to start an anti-feminist movement. But because of the ambiguities in governance and because of the emotional experiences of women in these institutes, it has unpredictable outcomes and often lends itself to a particularly individualistic, liberal understanding of feminism. So, and then in chapter 7, I conclude and I argue that whatever political direction state formation takes in Iran, the Iranian people have the female population to thank for fueling the move towards equality, justice, and peace.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Shirin. Arzoo, would you like to comment and discuss and pose some questions so we can have a conversation?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you again for Princeton for inviting me. It's such a delight to be in conversation with Shirin about this book. I've been asked to speak about the book's intellectual contribution, and I have 3 introductory remarks, and then I'll say a few words about the intellectual contribution. So the first thing I want to say is that there's so much about this book's argument that is original and innovative. And in fact, it's a great conversation for us to be having on the heels of the last session 2 weeks ago on the forgotten mundane about the everyday lives of Iranians. So to begin, this book is published in Cambridge University Press's Middle East Studies series. And the first book in that series, some of you might remember, was Parvin Peydar's Foundational Women and the Political Process in the 20th Century Iran, published 27 years ago. And it's fitting that this book is the most recent installment, the 65th, by the way, of an examination of the entire Middle East that began with Peydar's opening. This book is also written with extreme sensitivity to detail that evinces a deep reflection of and engagement with her interlocutors and the other data that she brings into the story, which I hope we'll talk about in a few minutes. And my final introductory remark is for readers and perhaps instructors thinking about adopting this book for teaching. It would be an excellent choice because it is a model of inspired scholarship. The writing is elegant and clear. The theory is woven in with rich data, and the book is just filled with granular detail, luminous stories, and it's narrated with a tremendous respect for her interlocutors. So it's fitting that in the acknowledgements, Shirin notes that it is her wish that in reading the book, her interlocutors can see how intensely she thought about their conversations long after they had parted. And this sentence alone speaks not just to her sensitivity and humility with which she writes the book, but also that this work, scholarly though it is also intended as much for her interlocutors as for us, the scholarly community. And this speaks to a rare accountability undertaken in this project, which I did not want to go unremarked on. Now to the book's intellectual contribution. Shirin suggests that there's a gap in women's or gender studies of Iran because much of the scholarship with regard to how women think about their status and rights within Iran's post-revolutionary society has failed to take into account the significance of the war, which occurred during the state's formative period, 1980 through 1988. In addition to neglecting women's roles and responses as conditioned by war, scholars have largely avoided speaking with more conservative and non-elite women who were in fact quite active in preparing the grounds for daily engagement with state forces, whether it be through formal interactions with its institutions or in other everyday experiences, especially again in the years just after the revolution. As such, scholars have tended to focus on movements that engage the state, moreover, rather than everyday life. So it is from these interesting propositions that Shirin rightly situates her work to build on and dialogue with some of the other scholars who have studied the everyday encounters with non-elite women and other populations, and have shown how the state employed women as important tropes for the post-revolutionary state, and then women in turn have made use of that trope to make the state answer to their concerns. Now, building on these insights, Shirin adds that there are few, if any, studies that explore the effects on the war, on the status and formation of women's rights, their roles and responsibilities, and in conditioning the formation of the state. So she sets out to explore some understudied areas. 1, daily acts as opposed to movements. 2, a range of non-elite women, from conservative supporters of the Islamic Republic to leftist activists. And she does all of this, 3, while moving beyond the limits of rights-based discourses that relate exclusively to engagements with state institutions. So as such, Shirin wades through an immensely rich set of data, which includes interviews with some 200 women who hold a range of political views, prison memoirs. And I just want to say, reading the book last night, she has every single prison memoir that she discusses in the book, she has also interviewed the author. So this is just how thorough her work has been. She's also read many notable texts of the time, including Khomeini's speeches, and just on and on. This offers a scintillating opening to an inquiry that suggests a veritable reframing of how we think about Iranian women's lives. Shirin examines women's rights, responsibilities, and status through this broader analytic framework of citizenship. And so she pushes scholars and other Iran observers to re-examine our understandings of the relationship between the Iranian state, its institutions, and its people through a specific kind of citizenship, gendered citizenship, which she argues is important in understanding the operations of the state, whether it be its institutions, its actors, but also the everyday lives of Iranian women. Now, in this moment of decentering the West and decolonizing academic knowledge, I want to point out that Shirin's use of citizenship is very intentional. She states in the book's introduction that she doesn't take citizenship as central to state formation, and that to avoid the Eurocentric gaze, she seeks to question even her own assumptions in order to see more plainly what the post-1979 Iranian experience can teach us about citizenship and statecraft. And finally, I want to return to her research methodology. Shirin brings a unique focus and sensitivity through her own voice. She employs a methodology to which she refers as self-reflexivity. She's in the book herself, and she has this persistent self-reflexivity that establishes both her authority and credibility with respect to the data, but it also shows her to be a researcher capable of nuance, who is sensitive and sincere. This self-reflexivity, moreover, shapes the book's findings and leads to astute points about her own ways of thinking and engagement with her interlocutors, and how that shaped her own research path, her trajectory, and indeed her expectations. So I have a number of questions, but I do want to give our audience a time to also chime in. Because the book is so richly detailed, I just want to start by asking you, Shirin, if you could highlight for us from your research some of the examples that show how non-elite women have negotiated or engaged with what you say is the state's gendered citizenry regime, and what were the results? So please expand on this idea of acts of citizenship and how some of these non-elite women have negotiated their rights, roles, and responsibilities, as you put it so nicely.
Thank you. Thank you, Arzoo. That was so kind. You took my breath away. That was very generous. I really appreciate your comments. I want to say that any scholarship, because I want to say this because there's probably graduate students and young scholars that are watching or will watch this. Any scholarship, I would argue, that's worth the paper that you're writing it on and the time that you're taking is really a collective, it's a collective effort. I would not have been able to do this research or this work if I didn't have a wonderful doctoral supervisor who gave me the freedom to pursue my ideas, fully knowing, both of us, that I might fail and I might just not even get the PhD that I was applying for. But it was that kind of commitment to a particular project, I think, that it takes to create what you beautifully articulated, as inspiring work, a work that can be useful to different communities. So I was fortunate that I had a wonderful review process at Cambridge University Press. I had amazing friends and colleagues in Iran. Without, their support, this book would never have been possible. And so it's a collective effort, it's a national effort, which is why I dedicated to the people of Iran, because it was because of what they did. I was just narrating, what I saw. So thank you. So acts of citizenship, I like your question because it lets me get into a few things. So, I understand myself to be a part of a community of scholars, such as Dion Brand, Ronaldo Wilcott, Christina Sharp, Michael Anderson and his new book, A Nation on No Map. Scholarship that really is not just critical of citizenship, but believes in citizenship in the normative way, but believes that it needs to be dismantled, that it's part of the problem, it's part of the oppression. So whether we're looking at women in Iran, or we're looking at refugees, or African Americans in the United States, consistently citizenship shows us that discrimination and exclusion is central to how it operates as a form of governance. So I want to say that right up, that I'm not one of those scholars that, believes that citizenship is liberating, and I went searching for this. And the particular, and thank you, Arzoo, for mentioning, I tried to be as delicate as I could be about explaining how this notion operates in my work. And so acts of citizenship, as I was doing the fieldwork for this project and reading the memoirs and conducting interviews, I really struggled with, I knew I wanted to talk about the state, and I wanted to take the conversation beyond resistance. I wanted to show that what I knew, and subconsciously, and through my travels and my youth to Iran and my own family, that there was something larger happening. Iranian women's role was not only to resist domestic oppression and participate in the reform movement, they were actually changing how, if we understand the state to be an imagined construct, they were changing how that construct was conceived in people's minds. So it was very tough for me to make this connection. Acts of Citizenship, Ingen's work came out right around the time that I was doing my PhD, and I felt like it clicked, because for me, for me, this book shows how, in many ways, citizenship in non-democratic settings or hybrid regimes is quite similar to democratic settings. And it shows, for me, a nation that's on the verge of something else. So this acts of citizenship is moving us towards something, I think, that is greater than the nation state entanglement with citizenship. But so the idea of acts of citizenship, it develops really out of political philosophy, but also feminist scholars were talking about acts of citizenship prior to Ingen's work. And so it's the idea of accounting for resistance in everyday life and interventions that may be intentional or may not be intentional. And so I saw this, like, as you said, usually the studies focus on movements. And what I was seeing was just individually, women, whether we're talking about the 1980s or today, individually, they were taking on this labor, and it is exhausting if you have lived and worked in Iran to every day. I mean, you probably get that sense when you read the book, how exhausting it is for these women to constantly be at the forefront of really what are at times violent and bloody battles in many ways. Yeah, this is what I saw, and I wanted to capture that. And so acts of citizenship is just about interventions and routine governance. So for instance, when Zahra Hosseini, who the book Daw narrates her story through Sayyida Azama Hosseini is the author, when she stays in Khorramshahr and she depicts this very terrifying, for those of us that are scared of dogs, which I am one of those people, she depicts this terrifying scene of, pushing away wild dogs from the dead bodies that were everywhere until they were buried. And this is a woman who really, I mean, there's a part in her book where she talks about men in the military were accusing her of doing spy work or trying to disrupt what they're doing. There was even threats of arrest. So this is one illustration of how this routine routine of governance is disrupted, not necessarily with any kind of a feminist framework in her mind. I want to make that clear. I mean, I talk about my positionality as a feminist scholar, but I really don't impose that on the women that I spoke to, because it just wasn't, they talked about women's rights and inequality, but they didn't engage explicitly with that term. But so she does this for a variety of reasons. She thought it was the right thing to do. She wanted to defend her country due to her religious beliefs, being young and adventurous. And so that's one illustration. Another one that always stays with me are leftist political prisoners, women in prison, which is also today. It's not just from the 1980s, it continues to today, where women are not given, the hygienic things that they need, the products that they need. And, having a child in prison that you don't have diapers for. And so, women coming together to help one another, to, share the clothing that they have to make a diaper for that child, to massaging each other's feet when after the lashings, to singing and supporting one another through these very physical and emotional ways. I mean, this would be another illustration of an acts of citizenship. There are so many. I mean, when I think about later on, I did a lot of interviews with young women who had lost their fathers in the Iran-Iraq War. And so, just being in the university, this is all prior to 2009. After 2009, it became very difficult for those families to speak anymore. But being in the public eye and challenging the political structures, and with the hope of upholding their fathers' democratic ideals as they understood them, that's an intervention in routine governance. And we know that because after 2009, they were eliminated from the public sphere in many ways, and another group of families came in who are at the time more accommodating to whatever the narrative of the day was for them at that particular moment. So these are all illustrations of how women are disrupting routine forms of governance and pushing back and creating another way of thinking about what the state could be.
I see Behruz here. So is it okay if I pose one more quick question?
No, absolutely, absolutely. I just wanted to follow up on that question, but I can go later, no problem.
Okay. I think I'm curious then. So you gave us great examples, and actually you covered some of the things I wanted examples from during the war and political violence against women. and this idea of caring work, which you talk about also through the notion of khudsazi, which I love. But I would also like to know then, because even in the title of your book, this is about how it conditions the Iranian state. So in what ways have these non-movement and non-intentional perhaps acts acted on the state to what you say remake its citizenry agenda? How has the state changed? Could you give us some examples?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because most of the time when we think about change, we immediately think about legal transformations or something. And I think this is actually what the Islamic Republic is overlooking. They think because something is not tangible that it's not present. I think the ways that they disrupted routine governance, well, sometimes it was simply refusing to wear a black chador in the prisons when they went for interrogations, and the state having to just cut back on that. For those of us that have since that time experienced interrogations, we know how important those moments of controlling your body and resisting even the very things that you might think are not important, but resisting that in that moment gives you self-confidence to live another day. So sometimes it looks like that, where they just kind of back off a bit or change the rules and regulations in a particular space. Parveen Haydar's book illustrates that a lot of the changes about custody, child custody at the end of the war was actually because of wives of martyrs who had lost their husbands, but were also losing custody of their children. So those legal transformations in terms of custody were initiated by Islamist women in Majlis who collaborated with women who had lost their husbands. But I think, so this, we can give more examples about women, being pushed away from the war front, but insisting to be present. We can talk about how the institution of the family changed when young women decided to join their brothers or uncles in the political struggle. Yeah, we can talk about all of those, but what I think is really important and what I think people, overlook or underestimate the significance of is that these are our stories. I mean, these are stories that circulate within the Iranian nation. I mean, for those of us that had loved ones in prison in the 1980s, at the time, it was a very lonely existence because, it was just this horrible thing that you knew the state can just come and take people that you love away. And it was a big secret, but it's not a secret anymore. It's because those stories started to circulate. So for me, the most important ways that the state changed, I think it's in the minds of the nation about what's possible. But I think it's very important because a lot of this, the mass execution of the left, the extensive loss of men who fought in the Iran-Iraq war, who had, from what we read in the books, and their families who had more democratic perspectives and views, we lost ancestors, we lost parents, So that's why for me, it was just so serious. I had to do justice to that so that, it would be in the history books.
I just want to remind our audience that they can submit their questions through the Q&A button. If Arzoo, you would like to continue with your questions, please go ahead.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but until we have people who have their questions read out loud, I will continue a little bit, if you don't mind. I know that one of the more, maybe not intellectually challenging, but emotionally challenging aspects of doing this project was to attend to the trauma of many of your interlocutors and the political violence that they endured. And you reference various dilemmas for the women who were supporters of the revolution and then the newfound post-revolutionary state. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how the analysis in your book about political violence can help us understand some of the contemporary forms of violence against women, not necessarily by the state, but we've, the news, we've been reading about violence against women, and it seems your book has something to say to this. So I was hoping maybe you might want to comment on it.
One of the things that I learned in conducting research for this book is how acceptable and how normal extreme forms of violence seem in the moment that they're happening if no one says anything. So that's, I know it sounds, it sounds kind of simple, but this was a very unsettling feeling that I experienced consistently. And again, it shouldn't be surprising because, for instance, prior to the 2009 presidential conflict and the stories that emerged about what was happening in the prisons, many people, liberal people who wanted reform and change, when you would mention the 1980s, they would say, well, they were, monaferin, or they were attacking the country, or they were not part of the nation. And so what I learned about political violence is that it operates on so many different levels. I think there was a story I mentioned in one of, it might have been in chapter 2, about one of the women, Nina, I cannot remember her last name, but she was active in the Iran-Iraq war, and she talked about domestic violence and abuse, from, I think it was a brother, because she was participating and she was leaving the house. So it operates on many different levels. There's the legal structure, there's the family, there's the rest of us who, kind of look away and say, maybe that person deserves it, or maybe I'm very much so active in movements that work towards dismantling the prison system in the US. And one of the things you always encounter from a large part of the population is that, well, what are you going to do? Some of these people are really dangerous. Some of them have actually killed people. What are you going to do? I think that understanding that political violence operates on different levels requires that we look for new sources of knowledge, very creative ways of thinking about old problems. But all of that is really dependent on recognizing how normal something might seem until someone says this is unacceptable.
So let me, with Professor Osanloo's permission, I go to a couple of questions from our audience. There's a question about the changes that, with the election of President Raisi and this move toward more consolidation of power in one faction in the state. How do you see the future of this kind of dynamic between acts of citizenship and the possibilities of state transformation, or the transformative effect and power of these acts of citizenship, considering these kind of political changes that has happened in Iran now?
I have to, first of all, admit that I'm not one of those Iranian authors or thinkers that also gives policy or news advice. One of the reasons I was able to put so much energy in this work is actually because I tried to stay away too much from, commenting or thinking about the day-to-day things that were happening. So I strongly recommend that for graduate students and young scholars. But, I think citizenship, acts of citizenship, including have their limits. I don't think that, the way to address what's happening in Iran today, part of it, I guess it would be wonderful for protests and this kind of collective voice standing up to the state. But, this has a very high cost for people. And so, yeah, for me, the current events with Raisi's presidency and with the beheading of Mona Haydari and Ahvaz, I think about the limits of citizenship. I think about my African-American colleagues and friends and scholars in Black studies, what they talk about, that this is really, in the short term, yes, we want people to be held accountable. We want to point out the problems and the flaws in what they're doing. But I think in the long term, as Iranian intellectuals, as individuals that care about what happens in the future in Iran, I think we need to really put our energy and our creativity towards solutions that are global. Because for me, if it resolves, an issue in Iran, but this framework is oppressing someone in the United States, then it's still not the solution for me. And so right now, my current work, I'm really trying to think about, and I don't think we need to bring this like from another world and down to the earth. I think people are living and through new forms of organization and relationships every day. We just need to acknowledge it and recognize it and write about that and pay attention to that. So that's the kind of work I'm trying to do. What does moving beyond the nation state and citizenship look like in the contemporary period? And one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about today, and this comes from my reading in African American studies, is the importance of intercommunal relationships, a relationship between communities in different spaces. This is what I'm all about in terms of my time and my activism and my intellectual labor. But otherwise, reading about, what's happening in Iran and what's happening with Raisi, I think the people of Iran will determine that. I think, the people, I think one of the things that my book demonstrates is the brilliance, the creativity, the problem solving, the commitment that people have in their everyday life to make their lives better. And so that, I say, we have to wait and see what the people of Iran do. It's really not something that I have a resolution for.
I think this is an interesting position that goes back to what Arzoo raised in terms of a theme that is very kind of prominent in the book in terms of acts of citizenship. And the way I read acts of citizenship in your book, it's situated against understanding sort of formal recognition of rights versus acts of citizenship. And that kind of transformative power that these acts of citizenship offer, which doesn't necessarily, at least in my reading of your book, it doesn't necessarily lead to the dismantling of the state or dismantling of the notion of citizenship, but it opens up a different kind of social space for participation. And a lot of these spaces that are created in society are spaces that are the unintended consequences of the state policies, and that comes through in your particularly in the last couple of chapters. That comes through so nicely, and perhaps the entire story of post-revolutionary state is about the unintended consequences and how these unintended consequences involved those acts of citizenship. And without kind of struggling for, although that's also part of the struggle, for recognition of formal rights. And that's why I think a lot of people who read the situation in Iran cannot truly appreciate the significance of these acts of citizenship because they're exclusively looking for formal recognition of rights as citizens, and I think this is really nicely comes through in the book, and I think that's a significant contribution there, and I also wanted to push you a little bit on that notion of the way people act based on their immediate experiences, and And I wanted to see if we can see that in relation to how can we articulate those acts in relation to a sort of collective memory, a historical collected memory that is appropriated and has become part of the conscious and unconscious subjectivity of these actors. So sometimes I felt that you sort of put these two in a binary, that there are immediate experiences and how individuals act, and they construct through those acts competing temporalities.
Mm.
And I love the way that you put these temporalities of the leftists and the Hezbollahis and the war veterans all together, which is, I think, again, this is another beautiful sort of part of the book, that all these temporalities coexist next to one another, but they also at the same time are a reflection of some sort of collective memory, some sort of historical temporality that is reappropriated in their mind and based upon which those acts find their own meaning. So do you see that kind of distinction? I mean, that was my reading, that I felt that you sort of distinguish these two spheres of immediate experience versus those historical temporalities that otherwise would have been a sort of point of
Yes,
departure for a lot of actors.
absolutely. I think that's a brilliant point, because in many ways, as Arzoo also mentioned, when I talk about the research process for me, that certainly, for me, that happened. Like the historical and the immediate was all blending. So it makes perfect sense that it would be the same for others. No, that's a very good point, and I will continue to think about that. Thank you.
Really good. So let me pose another question from the audience, which is about difficulties and obstacles that you face doing field work here in Iran. If you can talk a little bit about that, and also, I mean, you already mentioned about the recent honor killing in Khuzestan, but I don't want to go into that again. But if you could talk about problems and obstacles, because this is one of those sort of major issues for many scholars who think about field work and research inside Iran, both archival research as well as ethnographic work, interviews, and as such. So can you talk a little bit about this kind of, whether you face any problems and how you navigate that world inside Iran?
That's a very good question. It's a very it's a complicated question. I want to say first, as someone who's done a lot of field work and lived in Iran and did interviews and observations and archival work, there is something very unsettling about the entire Arzoo can probably the whole process of conducting field work. For me, it's something that I think someone once said, friends don't show up with recorders and then go and listen to your voice privately. And so I really struggle. One of the reasons that I really wanted to hold myself accountable, and I made that clear to everyone that I encountered, whether it was people in the field, I tried to show them, show them my character and how committed I am, and how important this research is for me, that it's a collective. I spent time getting to know people and allowing them to get to know me. And I returned to Iran. I think I finished like my PhD on a Tuesday, and I went to Iran like on a Friday. And this was in 2012. Because I had this, part of it I think was really guilt, the guilt of the kind of work that we do, because I had gotten so much from, this country and this nation, and I really wanted to give back. So I want to first of all say, I don't think we should take field work lightly. I think we should see it as a privilege as a very problematic practice in so many different ways. We're based in the United States, and we're traveling to other, we have all of these resources, and we're traveling to other parts of the world extracting information. And that's something that every person has to negotiate and come to terms with for themselves. And many don't do field work. I mean, we have some brilliant, I mean, I love Sarah Salim's book on Egypt is amazing. And she goes to Egypt and, you know, she's doing it completely differently. So I'm inspired by scholars who are looking for new ways of engaging with the archives, with voices. Arshina Adem Muqaddam's work is really pushing back on the boundaries on how we think about what is Iran, where is Iran. That was so liberating for me because I was like, okay, I can breathe. Whew, it's here, it's there. We can think about it, you know, collectively. And so I think it's really important for us to remain committed to thinking about field work and research always in new ways. So I didn't go into the field. I went because I had a very specific question. I was so focused and dedicated, and you know, I had so much energy. I don't have that. I could never do this again in this way. So you have to kind of assess who you are and where you are in your life. And, you know, obviously it's not safe. I mean, Fariba Adel Kha, so many other of our colleagues have had horrible experiences, including professors in Iran, teaching in Iranian universities. So it's nothing to, you know, take lightly. But I also would never tell someone not to go. I think that you just have to be prepared for whatever might happen when you go and treat people with respect and question yourself, why are you there? What are you looking for?
Thank you so much. Of course, this is quite a controversial issue that you know, where many universities actually deal with this question, and there are a lot of problems and obstacles for many scholars to do so. But I totally agree with your position on that. Let me just say a question, possibly last question from the audience that. You know, you so beautifully lay out these acts of citizenship as individual acts, but we do have like social movements that emerge from these social acts. And perhaps for all the people in the humanities and social sciences, the $64,000 question is that how do these individual acts are transformed into social movements? And do you see any connection between the subjects of your study and these acts of citizenship and the formation of sustained social movements?
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful question. So one of the clearest places that I saw that was I did field work in Iran. I mean, I started traveling there in 2005, 2006. I did field work in 2007, 2008, and then I returned and lived there for 2 years in 2012. And what was so fascinating for me was sort of how people that I knew in 2007 who wouldn't make eye contact with me and were really nervous about talking to me in 2012 were inviting me into their office and having conversations and engaging with my ideas. So I absolutely attribute that to the activism and the price that people paid in 2009 in particular. And so if we think about 2009, there's many different frameworks that we could use, but one of those frameworks is definitely that these individual acts came together and this sort of, very harmonized movement occurred, and people caught up. Those who were initially against some of those ideas caught up and started to question themselves. This turn is very consistent. You see this even from a distance about how people's politics changes in really transformative ways in Iran. And I attribute that to individual acts. And I think that women are leading that struggle in the country.
Fantastic. I mean, we have a number of questions that unfortunately will remain unanswered, but I am volunteering Shirin's time to respond to these questions. If you would like to email her and carry on the conversation in another medium. But again, I would like to thank you so much for writing this book and giving us this opportunity to have this conversation with you. And as always, my good friend and colleague Arzoo Osanloo for being here and leading the conversation. And hope to see you soon, next time in person in the good old Princeton.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.